associate professor at Notre Dame. I teach Italian literature, medieval Italian literature, including the great poet Dante, who is a great spiritual light. Swami stealthily inched his way into my life. I remember Christ's answer, "Who do you say that I am?" That's also Swami's answer. "Who do you say that I am?" It's the surrender of the finite self. You have to be willing to let go of what you think you are in order to awaken to the unlimited possibility of what we are in God.
You sound like a veteran. Have you done that?
I've been burning in this fire a while. Was Sam Sandweiss's The Holy Man and the Psychiatrist. I opened that book. I got to page 3. I remember it was the third page. And I just realized this is true. This is true. It's exactly as St. Augustine says, that no matter what the evidence may be, for or against, there is something in you that says this is the truth. It was actually my encounter with Satya Sai Baba that awoke me to the reality of Christ and of spiritual life and truth, and among other things, that all these stories in the Bible are not just fanciful. It was quite shocking to me to realize that most of them, maybe all of them, are literally true. Spiritual life is full of plateaus and dips and regressions and moves forward. Often, some sages have said it's kind of like a wave, that moves forward, but then it has to have a backwash in order to gather strength to move forward again. And spiritual life is also cyclical like that. It has these waves. And you can't just sustain a fever pitch all the time, because that's not the way anything works in nature. One person here on a sidewalk in Chicago, that's when she was a Baptist Christian, intensely into her, Baptist Christian church. And she was on lunch hour in Chicago, and this extraordinary figure, barefoot, orange robe with an afro, appears on the street in front of her and says, "Follow me." No, there's only one ultimate goal of life, and that is to live in the direct experience of God. And we all live in God already because there's nothing but God. But if it's a path that it makes every other path seem very insipid. If you take one step on this path, the most extraordinary things begin to happen. And joys come that cannot be uttered.
Christian Moevs, an associate professor at Notre Dame University, who now professes Holy Man Sri Satya Sai Baba as the spiritual compass of his life. Welcome to Souljourns. This interview was recorded in Chicago in July 2010.
Christian Moevs, Dr. Christian Moevs, welcome to Souljourns. It's such a delight. After a decade, when I last had a chance to hear you speak into a microphone, doing the simultaneous translation for Don Mario Mazzoleni prior to his death for the beautiful Sai Baba devotee interview. It's a delight to be able to have you just by yourself talking to us. And for those who are not totally up to date, and I'm not, why don't you begin by telling us your current professional status at Notre Dame University?
I'm an associate professor at Notre Dame. I teach Italian literature, medieval Italian literature, including the great poet Dante, who is a great spiritual light. And I'm interested in philosophy and in literature and poetry.
So which comes first for you, the poetry, literature, philosophy, or the spiritual pursuit?
Well, they're all one, but I realize that literature and poetry and philosophy are not ends in themselves. I think I used to think they were, but they lead to a deeper life, and they can prepare a deeper spiritual life, and they can work in harmony with it, but they can't take the place of your own focused spiritual search.
Am I wrong in thinking, in having assumed that you also taught theology at Notre Dame?
No, I don't really. I mean, I know something about it, of course, because it's related to the things I work on, and I certainly know something about it. But at Notre Dame in particular, theologians who teach Catholic theology have a special status. So they're also approved by the church, and it's quite a particular thing.
And they obviously know of your far-flung interests, global and galactic, probably, more than just local and university. How should I put this? You did a sterling translation for a book and for an audio interview, a video interview of Don Mario Mazzoleni, whose very notoriety was because he was excommunicated by the church that employs you, in a manner of speaking. They're okay with all of your spiritual interests, as they have to be, I would imagine.
Well, and Notre Dame employs a lot of people. I mean, I don't speak for Notre Dame, certainly. I am everybody at Notre Dame has their own spiritual life, but it's also a very serious research university, which means that inquiry is wide open, and you don't have to sign on any line about your set of ideas or beliefs, because everything is part of inquiry. Notre Dame has a very profound spiritual mission. How that connects then with other facets of spirituality is also something that's always open to question and investigation. But it's not an ideological place. That's what makes it a great university. It's a really spiritual place, which is not in the grip of an ideology.
Great definition. Thank you for explaining it that way. Your inquiry has brought you personally face-to-face with holy man Sri Satya Sai Baba from southern India. My guess is, off the top of my head, you may be the only employee, let alone professor, at Notre Dame who shares that interest.
There may be one or two others, actually, but yes, I mean, in my own life, my spiritual life started really with my contact with Satya Sai Baba. I was born Catholic. I mean, I was baptized Catholic. I was raised always Catholic. I am Catholic in this very profound sense. But I managed to go very nicely through 30 years of life as a Catholic without a real spiritual life. That's true of many of us. It was actually my encounter with Satya Sai Baba that awoke me to the reality of Christ and of spiritual life and truth, and among other things, that all these stories in the Bible are not just fanciful. Mm-hmm. It was quite shocking to me to realize that most of them, maybe all of them, are literally true.
Whereas many people think of them as being myths.
Well, my own parish priest when I was growing up was a very sophisticated type who would always explain why in the anthropology of the time, historically, it could appear that this miracle had happened, like the multiplication of the fishes. Well, the Jews at that time always carried food on them. It seemed to be time to eat, so they all took the food out, and it looked like now there was a lot more food than there was before. Now, this is my parish priest explaining this. Then, when you actually realize, well, here is someone now who actually does have that power and this sublime beauty and life-changing sweetness about it. You say, oh, this is how Christ worked. This is the reality. I remember the first time I went to the ashram, just dissolving into tears, watching Swami go by and watching a lady reach out to touch the hem of his robe. All these things that you read in the gospel, you're like, of course. But I could never have, from my limitations, reading the gospels, I could never imagine the beauty, the sublimity, and the truth that's actually right there on the page. I had to go all the way to India and encounter Sai Baba in order to awaken to the reality of my own faith. Now, the relation, how Sai Baba works with these things. I mean, the poet I study, Dante, well, what it took for him was to encounter Beatrice, to awaken to Christ, really, and to transform his life and to change. Took an encounter with this Florentine girl named Beatrice, and she becomes the figure who reveals, stands in for, is in a sense Christ in his life, because she brings that consciousness, that love, Christ to birth in him. Well, that's what Swami did for me.
Before going any further, I should ask you what initially drew you to Swami, or maybe it's the other way around. What brought Baba to you?
Right, you realize when you get into these things that you don't choose your guru, they choose you. You really don't have any choice in it.
We may think we do it.
We often think we do. We think, and certainly we can respond or not respond, and that often works out over many years and maybe even longer. Swami stealthily inched his way into my life. I remember I first saw his image and his name when my sister had invited me to dinner in her apartment in New York. We were both living in New York. I was studying at Columbia, and she was working there in the financial aid office. And she had a cassette tape of some bhajans. And I just noticed that with this picture of Swami on it, and I asked, so who's that? And so it's always that was the first encounter I had with, how do you answer that question? You always think, Christ's answer, who do you say that I am? That's also Swami's answer. Who do you say that I am? And it's like, her answer was, he's someone who has infinite powers. I thought, yeah, like what? Pure New York, he can create anything. He can destroy anything. He knows everything. He can read anybody completely, knows everything in their mind, everything in their lives. I said, oh, really? Not that I believed it. But on the other hand, I knew that my sister is much wiser than I am, and I knew that my sister knew that there was truth in all this. So I was going to not dismiss it, obviously. But she gave me a book to read, which was Sam Sandweiss's The Holy Man and the Psychiatrist. I opened that book. I got to page 3. I remember it was the third page. And I just realized this is true. This is true. It's exactly as St. Augustine says, that no matter what the evidence may be, for or against, there is something in you that says this is the truth.
Your story parallels to a T. Jody's.
Yeah.
She saw a picture in a man's wallet as he was paying a lunch check. She got that book, and within the first couple of pages, she knew. Many of us can't relate to that. That's just amazing.
For me, it was self-evident. That kind of sublimity, beauty is the hallmark. For me, that was the one guide I always had, was real beauty, of course. Beauty gets tainted with all kinds of things, but real beauty leads you straight to God if you follow real beauty, because God is beauty. And for me, the sublimity of just 2 or 3 gestures that Sandweiss recounts in those first pages, and you realize only the divine can do that.
Wow.
And then of course I cataclysmically had that experience over and over in relation to Satya Sai Baba.
So from the get-go, you really pretty much found yourself face to face, figuratively speaking, if not literally, with your guru who had called you. using your sister as
Right.
the vehicle.
Right. I mean, but then, you know, that first call, in my case, you know, there was so much in my life that was not, which was at variance with the kind of life and thought and purity that's required to enter more deeply into Christ, into truth, into Swami. That it took a long, you know, that just was the very start of a long process. I wouldn't even date my spiritual life from starting then. In fact, that happened around 1985.
I was going to ask you the date.
1985, and it was a gradual process that at first I had to read something about him. I'd have to read his words. I'd have to have a picture. And then I got a picture. I had a picture of him. So he started to, you know, create this sort of the space of the sacred in my life started to become more evident.
I encounter some people who have similar starts to their spiritual path that takes them in yet again a new direction, who, falling out's the wrong word, but sometimes they think twice about it and they withdraw a little bit from their spiritual pursuit. It's not that they reject it. Did you have any period?
Oh yeah, it's spiritual life is full of plateaus and dips and regressions and moves forward. Often, you know, some sages have said it's kind of like a wave, you know, that moves forward, but then it has to have a backwash in order to gather strength to move forward again. And spiritual life is also cyclical like that. It has these waves, and you can't just sustain a fever pitch all the time, because that's not the way anything works in nature. So what happened with me then was gradually I started to spend more time in that sort of sacred space around that image and name. Then in 1987, at the same time I started Columbia in graduate school, I started going to the Sai Center in Manhattan. A friend of mine actually set it up. I didn't even have the impulse initially, but he set it up. Then he decided it wasn't for him, but it turned out it was for me because I felt something there, that I felt a kind of sacred, again, stillness and sublimity. And the fundamental hallmarks of truth also in even Baba, this organization, you know, that's grown up in Satya Sai Baba's name, for me were very important. You know, that this idea that Baba has not come to create a religion, to call anybody to follow any creed or sect, but to ignite in them a deeper love and purity to follow their own path, their own religion. To make the Christian a true Christian, or the Hindu a true Hindu, because ultimately any path followed with full love and self-sacrifice does lead to God. And that was very important to me. Also, that it would have nothing to do with money. You know, that centers had nothing to do with money. Absolute hallmark.
It's poison.
Yeah,
Don't even
hallmark
think about
of truth.
raising funds for any cause.
Yeah, that Baba would not allow money to even be mentioned, and even for service projects. If people wanted to do a service project and there wasn't money, they weren't allowed to ask for it. The money would have to be there as part of the collective will to do it. Otherwise, it's not to be done, because obviously the will isn't there. These things seem so evidently true to me. They're the marks. Even the very fact that Satya Sai Baba is not trying to gather followers to himself. He has no interest.
Doesn't even want his name brought to America.
Yeah, he says, "Who are you to advertise me? What do you know of my reality?" You know, and that is the truth. I always tell my students too that if they are to encounter a spiritual guide of any sort, you know, in their lives, that the tests are precisely those, that they will never ask for money. They will not even ask for followers. Another one which is very important is that they always do mention self-sacrifice. Any spiritual teacher who does not mention the cost, which is which is crucifixion of the self, the cross, any spiritual teacher does not mention that is not a real spiritual teacher.
And by that, do you think he means the crucifixion of the ego first and foremost?
It's the surrender of the finite self. You have to be willing to let go of what you think you are in order to awaken to the unlimited possibility of what we are in God.
You sound like a veteran. Have you done that?
I've been burning in this fire a while. I've been burning a while.
And does the fire feel good?
The fire at periods is the most intense, exquisite pain that one can experience. That becomes almost indistinguishable from other moments when it's the most intense joy that humans can conceive. But it's beyond that. It's just burn. To burn with leaving no ash, no trace, to become just fire, That's...
It seems to be a prerequisite.
Well, it's the goal, too. It's what happens. There are no real prerequisites for spiritual life. We're all on it already. I mean, a friend of mine had this image that I liked. He was a big football player. He's a big Swami devotee, too. But I remember his talking to a group of kids once and telling them, you know, life is a game, and it has rules. And guess what? You're already playing the game. And the rules are already operative. They don't start tomorrow.
You may not be aware of it.
And that's true in spiritual life too. But we say that some people are on a spiritual path. Well, that's just because they become conscious of it and they become very focused on it. But every path is teaching us. And you can't get away from God. You can certainly try to hide your head, ignore it, but God is everywhere. It's kind of hard to flee.
Devotees also think God is in Puttaparthi. I mean,
Yeah.
if they're literally going to follow the teachings of the teacher, they know God's in themselves and that they are God. But let me just ask you two questions, and you can take your time or sort out which one to answer first. Tell us about some of the encounters, if they've been numerous or a few over the years with Baba himself. And I know you just returned. This is 2010. You just returned from his ashram in Prashanti Nilayam.
Yeah, my life changed radically in 1991. So I'd found out about Swami in 1985.
87, you had this.
And then I found myself in Italy. I was writing my dissertation, so I spent 2 years in Italy in 91. And I was going to the Rome Center, an exquisite place. One of the Rome centers, there were 4 at that time in Swami's name. An extraordinary place. And they then were arranging a trip to India. They do that. The Italians were very organized, and they would take care of everything. I just realized I would be going. It wasn't a choice. Before in New York, all these people were going to India. They were going on retreats. They were doing. I thought, why do they want to do all these things? I had no clue. It shows I wasn't ready. Clearly, all of a sudden I realized I was going, so I must be ready. Right? I was going. In fact, it all worked out. And there were so many. Oh, what that first trip, that changed everything. That changed everything. Lessons everywhere, too. We were supposed to leave January 3rd, I remember, but instead I got a call saying, oh, well, that group got too big, so they're making a new group, and you've been put in the new group. It's leaving January 7th. I said, fine. Turned out, I found out later, there was actually issues about that. Fortunately, I didn't know anything about it, so I was fine. Because that first group was being led by this wonderful lady, Jeje and Oscar, president of the Rome Center. And everybody wanted to be in their group because their groups always got called by Swami for interviews. In fact, they had done over 50 trips, and every group had been called, sometimes several times, in fact, many times, multiple times. So apparently some people were loath to leave that group and go into the other group. Turns out, of course, the other group was led by this extraordinary lady, who is in a sense my spiritual godmother, because she's the one who led me there. A woman of, she's someone to do an interview with. Boy, she's incredible. And she's had incredible experiences too.
You going to give us her name?
Yeah, her name is Luciana, which means light, incidentally. Yeah. I won't get sidetracked on her right now.
So you went with the, let's say, lesser desired group, but I suspect it was better for you.
Well, of course, then you start realizing that from even before you go, everything's orchestrated. Everything is orchestrated on these trips. They're all under Swami's control. And that's something that's part of how it works inside. When you start realizing that nothing could possibly engineer all this.
Even the individual person's experiences.
Everything. I'll tell you a story later about how some of these things work, which is just sort of a... So then we left January 7th. There was a group of 13, an extraordinary group. There were 4 young men in the group, one of whom had multiple sclerosis, quite advanced, so he was largely paralyzed, and with all kinds of issues. And when we arrived, remember we were put in a shed, the big common rooms, and that wasn't going to work for our multiple sclerosis afflicted friend, Giuseppe. So we went to the office. I remember just doing an intense prayer to Swami. I guess that first time I did an intense prayer to Swami right there. And instantly at that moment, someone walked in with a key and they handed it to us and we had a room. So I mean, everything sort of started like that. And I started to realize, this is how it works. Everything is, you've got to connect on a much deeper level here. And that trip completely changed my life. We were there for only 2 or 3 weeks. I could go on about all kinds of things, but what the culmination of the trip was that on January 16th at 7:10 in the morning, Swami had come out and given darshan, walked among everyone. And it was the day that the big group that we were not in, Oscar and Jajez group, was leaving, and they hadn't been called yet. But they got first row, so everybody assumed, Swami often calls groups on the last day, so he'll call them today. And so they were all sitting in the front. It was a big group, it was around 50 people. And we were behind, and Swami comes by, and over the heads of the group that was leaving, he just points at us and says, "Go." He calls us in over the heads of the other group. There were a lot of lessons there, for the other group. There are certain dynamics that were not the way things probably should have been perfectly and so forth. And in our group, everything had come together in an extraordinary way. We sort of knew something was going to happen. In fact, Luciana, the night before, said tomorrow morning he's going to call us. Wow. She knew these sorts of things. She was always in touch.
Knowing full well the first group was still there one more day.
I know, and she was one of the ones who was, insistent that they go, first. But she had that already. She had that premonition. She already knew that what would happen. She knew. She was in tune. Anyway, Swami called us in, and I remember, we went up on the veranda. And he came by. He was going to deal with some other things, and he just stopped and looked at me. And it was quite a look. It was quite a look.
How far was he from you?
That was about 5 feet. And it was almost a withering look. He says, I know everything about you, is basically what that look said. I'll deal with you in a minute. And so then we went inside. I was translating for the group, so they made me sit right next to him, right by his right arm. And he was dealing with all kinds of things in the group, very beautiful things. You know, one of our members, his wife had a serious illness, and his big question was whether she needed an operation. And he had been telling us about this. And the first thing Swami said when he just came into the room, you know, and sat down, he looked at that person and said, no operation. She's in my hands. Right? So before, he didn't ask anything.
You saw this happen.
Oh yeah, I mean, but this, you know, those of us who've been around Swami, you know, it's like.
And he spoke only Italian, I'm sure.
He did all kinds of funny things with language and that thing.
No, the person who's.
Oh yeah, of course, they only spoke. Yeah, they only spoke Italian. Yeah. I was the only person who spoke English in that group. Yeah. Swami did use some Italian with some of these people too, though. And then there was a young lady who had all kinds of flighty emotional instabilities, but you could see there was something very deep and great about her, but she had all kinds of surface turmoil. And he talked to her under his breath, looking at her. I could barely hear him, and it wasn't Italian, and it wasn't English. I don't know what it was, but it was like he was working on her anyway. Then another beautiful thing. So he turns to another member of our group. We're all dressed exactly the same, right? You know, just the men are all in white. He turns to this one man and says, "What's wrong with the boy?" Well, the person he asked happened to be the doctor in our group. He's a medical doctor. The one doctor in our group. He turns to him and says, "What's wrong with the boy?" Of course, Swami knew that too. So he said, "Multiple sclerosis, Swami." So I said, yes, I know. Hasn't walked in 7 years, which is exactly right. Giuseppe told us 2 days before, you know, it's been 7 years since I walked last time. You know, all these things. And then he materialized a medallion for Giuseppe and told him to wear it. And then he had 2 people hold him up, and he massaged his right side. And then Giuseppe could stand, actually led him out of the room. That was the first time he had walked in all that time. But he also made it very clear, you know, that was actually at the end of the interview. He led him out of the room, just holding his hand like that, you know, and he actually could walk, you know, he could do it, it was in him. But he said very clearly, Swami said, "No wheelchair." He said, "Practice, practice, practice." He said. It was a really profound, it was very, very clear the way he said it. And I understood, you know, that, you know, the maladies, Giuseppe was wearing them on the outside, we all had them on the inside. And the message was for all of us too. No wheelchair, practice. You know, that you have to find the strength in you to actually start making moves towards God. And God then, of course, runs towards you. But God doesn't do the work. I was just reading today, you know, that Swami said, you know, I can turn sky into earth and earth into sky, but I cannot move the human heart 1 inch closer to God. Because we have to do that. We have to respond. He's right there. If we don't respond, you know, Christ's parable of the wheat, you know, of sowing, you know. So, anyway, at a certain point in that interview, he turned to me. And he was right there, you know, his face was 3 feet from mine. And I'm not going to go into all the things he said. It was interesting. He was using kind of a code between me and him. He would say one thing, all this stuff would flash into my mind, and then he would know exactly, of course. And I would start and I said, no, don't say it. He would know exactly, of course. It was this kind of conversation. But absolutely clear, absolutely no question, you know, about all of the stages in it. But he was very stern initially. It was frightening isn't the word. It's, there's that word that they use in the Bible too, that God is awesome. That's the mark of the divine. It's terror-inducing in a way. How do you explain it? A kind of fear. No, it's something in you knows. There was something in me that knew that this being in front of me had the power over my very life. With one thought, I would cease to exist. I mean, that radical. My dependence on that reality, whatever it was absolute. It was the first time that I had ever in my life run into a power so much greater than anything I can conceive that I surrendered. I'd never surrendered to anything. It was like a brick wall, running headlong into a brick wall. So anyway, he turns to me with this fire. I mean, there's this kind of fire shiva in him, and he's very stern. He says, "You're here, you're there, you're everywhere, monkey mind." There. I mean, it was awesome, And then he slapped me hard. It wasn't one of those like little tender slaps. It was a real shock to my whole psyche. He slapped me. He said, "Monkey mind, mad monkey mind," he said to me. And then instantly he completely transformed. He became, and I've never been able to communicate any of this, he became sweeter, deeper, more loving. I've never experienced anything like that. You can say 1,000 times the most intimate love you've ever experienced from your mother, but it's much more than that. A sweetness. He looked into my eyes with a completely unutterable sweetness and just said, "Love, love, love," he said to me. And then he turned and started dealing with other people. I was there sobbing, at his feet. I mean, it was like, and if there are lifetimes, that was any number of lifetimes in one moment. It changed everything. That changed everything in my life, that one moment. And then he started dealing with other people. He was talking to people over here, so he was looking over there. And I was right next to his arm, was on the armrest of his chair. His right arm just lightly placed there. And I was staring at it because I longed to touch it, and I didn't dare. And so then his hand came down and just took my hand. He was just looking over, his hand came down and brought my hand up onto the armrest. And he held my hand and stroked it, and I just buried my face in his sleeve and just cried. And I just cried. And then every once in a while he needed his arm to do something, so he'd take it away and do something, and then he'd bring it back and take my hand again.
Christian, before you go on, do you think maybe some of this is because you're an intuitive, a person whose senses are at a level that maybe others can't relate to? That you had this unmistakable initial contact with him?
I mean, I can say that I said when I first read some of his words, I recognized something in me awoke, and there was nothing that I can do about that. It's just a fact. It's not a belief. It's nothing I could abjure or give up. It's just a fact. It's part of the reality of what I am. That recognition. It's as deep as my own soul. I had a much deeper experience of that than when I arrived in India and went to the first darshan that evening. I was sort of out of it, actually at that moment. But Swami appeared. He came out, and just seeing him there was another of these huge shocks. And it was the feeling, the precise feeling there. It was absolutely clear. It was like, oh my, this has been going on a long time. I realized that there was nothing in this life, in this lifetime, in these parameters of this form, that could account for that connection that I felt. I mean, it was going back. I felt as if this was a story that had been going on for 10,000 years, 10,000 lifetimes. I mean, it was just absolutely unmistakable. Unmistakable. I just knew. There was nothing that could account for that power,
So
that connection.
a question that I've had of late, and I've come up with my own explanation, but I'm not sure I'm right. People who are watching this for the first time, who, for whatever reason, I'm watching a man who's special. He has this special connection. And then they'll hear that Baba says we're all equally
Yeah.
special. There's nobody more special than the other.
Yeah.
But what accounts for those who get it, those who intuit it, those who respond to it, and those who feel it to the level you did, and others who don't?
It's all a question of timing. You know, everything in nature has its time. I mean, you look at a pear tree, you know, and there's one pear over there is ripe and about to fall off. Another one is green and just starting. And they're at different points on a trajectory, at different points. But do you say the right pear is a greater pear, a better pear than the other one? I mean, they're all exactly the same thing. They're at different points in their life stories. And even the stages in spiritual growth don't all happen in the same order. So you can't even say, oh, this person's really advanced and this one isn't. You have to be very careful of those things. The other thing about it all is that when we say things like that, it all pertains, I mean, about level of spiritual maturity or readiness or evolution. Those all pertain to an ego complex, a finite sense of self, a tissue of associations, of desires, of fears, a train of memory and thought that we identify completely as ourselves. That is a highly illusory structure. And that structure has its own history. What the reality, the deeper soul, spirit that is the reflection of, is completely immune to all that. It's one of the sublime truths in Dante, you know, that becomes very, very clear that no matter what your characteristics you're given by nature, for instance, because you could say, oh, well, some people also have, you know, a body and mind that's more attuned to spiritual life than somebody else, or a set of circumstances for sure, and often we don't control those. Well, none of that precludes our awakening to that fundamental truth, that reality, that all this is a reflection of this deeper reality, and we're that.
In a manner of speaking, you are Dante. What would Dante say of Sai Baba?
Well, you know you don't know, Dante is an extraordinary free, creative genius. The church, in fact, is always, he's now the glory of Catholic literature. The Benedict XVI started his papacy quoting Dante on love, and you know, he's definitely sort of the greatest of all Christian poets, probably the greatest of all Western poets, certainly. And the glory of the Catholic faith. Now, there's a lot in Dante that it's always at a deep level, it is all sublimely true. But if one wants to start thinking about, you know, details of doctrine, orthodoxy, there's all kinds of things in Dante that are not at all the most canonically orthodox way of putting things and seeing things. Again, if you put the question marks deeper down, right, then you can always start seeing how, yes, of course, this is true. But Dante was highly suspect. So Thomas Aquinas is a free thinking spirit in a lot of ways, and was very much pushing the edge on a lot of questions. Something like in the great condemnations of 1277 of the Bishop of Paris, the condemnations would include about 30 of Thomas Aquinas' teachings. So Yeah.
Well,
And he is, he is about as orthodox as you can get. Orthodoxy is not an end in itself. It's important because, to how we conceive truth does have very much an effect on how available that truth is to us in some way, because of us, not because of the truth, but because of the way we approach it. So it is important. But
literature, arts, intellectual pursuits don't always jibe with spirituality.
True.
And with Sai Baba, I would think there might even be different hurdles that stand among them. But you seem to, with ease, cross over them.
Well, it wasn't easy. I mean, I was too intellectual. A friend of mine in the Manhattan Center, Baba Center, many years ago, after I had said something I thought was very clever in a study circle, and he never said anything because he was wiser. The language of the wise, silence. So I remember he gazed at me. I went back and was looking at he was talking. I wasn't talking. I was just because he didn't talk with it. He was gazing at me a bit, and I was looking at some books. And eventually, he just, after gazing at me a while, he said, "Christian, I'd like to cut you off here," he said, "because this isn't so bad." I'll never forget.
It wasn't on camera, but referring to your heart.
Right, this isn't so bad. That's all he said. And I was like mortally offended. And of course, it was one of the great spiritual lessons.
Get out of your head.
And that Swami, I think, finished breaking that down only a few years ago. And that was an extremely painful moment, because intellectual life it's a wonderful thing, and it is definitely a path to God. Sometimes I joke and say it's the slow boat, to China. It's like the last, when if you have pure devotion and simplicity, you could trip lightly across the ocean, and I have to paddle a boat, But it's not quite that simple. I mean, Aquinas is an example, for instance. St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the greatest intellectuals, one of the greatest minds in Western history, who combined that with the most extraordinary devotional life. And the two worked together to lead him straight into divine union in this life, really. Something that he actually, on theoretical grounds, sort of thought was not really possible, to see God face to face in this life. Mm-hmm. Aquinas thought, no, really only after you've left the body is that possible. Well, he had in his own lifetime an experience of that kind, something that stopped all his writing. And made the famous remark to his secretary, because he was leaving his great Summa Theologia unfinished. The capstone, one of the capstone works of his life. And his secretary was going nuts. This is Aquinas, who was, working on 6 things at once always. And he said, "Reginald, I can do no more." He said, "Such things have been revealed to me that everything I have written looks like so much straw." And Reginald recounts that. And he wrote nothing till the end of his life. He didn't live much after that. But in other words, intellectual life is, and this is a deep truth in medieval thought, that philosophy leads you towards the deeper mysteries of theology. Theology, again, which is also direct experiential. I mean, we're talking about an intense integrated prayer life and sacramental life that then leads you into the divine. But the intellect itself, of course, is not what, the mind, the thinking mind, is not what makes the direct contact with the divine.
Do you think
this thought ceases, and then the intellect is raised through love into the divine? But it works more that way. And that process, letting go your trust in your concepts and in your thought, is very painful, and it's essential.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we have contemporaries of Aquinas walking the earth today who are, whether they're aware of Baba or not, it's always been an interest of ours to pursue who they might be and where they might be, how many there might be. Do you think there are people we euphemistically refer to as realized beings?
Oh, the way the harmonies in nature and spirit work, because nature is spirit, right? The whole world is spiritual, as Augustine knew very well. The way it works is that when the disharmony increases, so do the forces of harmony to counteract it. That's why Satya Sai Baba is here. That's why you get these cataclysmic re-revelations of eternal truth. And Satya Sai Baba is the cosmic one. He's the most extraordinary, but he has dozens and dozens of what I would call sort of satellite avatars or beings, these extraordinary beings who are here too.
Would you put those people, would you characterize them as some of the living saints who come and walk among us and teach us their experiences today? From India, for example, Amaji or Sri Karunamai?
Right, well, Amachi is certainly one of them, and Karunamai, and I've encountered a number, Mother Mira, I've actually encountered a number of these beings,
And what did you initially come to understand about them, and how do you see them today, using your words, that they're satellite emissaries of
right,
I
mean, divine reality is there. We are, again, using sort of Dantean or late medieval terms, forms in this world are more or less transparent. They embody more or less perfectly, in a sense, or communicate more or less perfectly the reality which gives them being. Right? That reality gives everything being, but a rock does not communicate the divine reality from which alone it has its being, nearly as well as a living human eye. You look into a human eye and say, well, you can't. One of the mysteries, we can't look into a human eye too long because it's too much. It's consciousness. That's the ground. That's the ground right there. That's where it all starts, right? So now, and every human is a colossal concentration of this reality, of this spiritual ground of reality. We're not usually that aware of it. If we awake to it, we again transform. Our lives are transformed in a way that communicates it more perfectly and more powerfully. The light is no longer under a bushel. There are beings, though, who, just by their nature, come into the world as just wide open. First of all, they usually also have extraordinary powers that come with consciousness and love being so anchored in the ground of reality that all reality is a manifestation of that consciousness and love.
I'm going to go back to the second question I asked you about Baba 10 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, that might tie into what you're talking about right now, and that is the contrast between the Baba you've come to know, love, appreciate, and learn from the late 80s, early 90s forward, to the Baba you may have encountered recently in 2010, outwardly a changed being.
Yeah.
Don't know, I would be totally ignorant to try to categorize in which way changed, but might that in some small measure set the platform for these satellite saints to be among us today?
Well, it's difficult to have the kind of direct contact and access with Satya Sai Baba at this point that I was able to have, still in the 90s, and that people who in the 70s and 80s had 100 times more, at length. You can't quantify access to Baba. I mean, first of all, he's everywhere, and I've had experiences here in America with Swami that are as intense as things I've had in India, because here is everywhere again. But yes, I do understand it as these great beings and souls, and there are a number of them around, allow this direct contact and diffusion of this direct encounter. I mean, you know, in my case, it was essential, perhaps for my own obtuseness, to come into direct contact with a living, embodied form of this reality. The way Dante needed Beatrice. Dante was, had all the teachings of the Catholic Church, but it wasn't until he encountered Beatrice in this love and started to meditate on what it meant that he started to awaken. I needed this form. I'm full of reverence for instance, a lot of my fellow Catholics, for example, who have this intense faith in Christ and an intense sense of the reality and presence of Christ from having read. I'm Thomas. I had to go and actually get slapped across the face to wake up. And they read 2 words in the gospel and they see this is true. And you know, so how whether we need a direct encounter with one of these great avatars or living saints in certain circumstances for certain people and for certain paths, yes, but that can happen in any number of ways. Satya Sai Baba has introduced himself to, I know about a dozen people who first encountered Satya Sai Baba when he appeared physically to them wherever they were. One person here on a sidewalk in Chicago, that's when she was a Baptist Christian, intensely into her, Baptist Christian church, and she was on lunch hour in Chicago, and this extraordinary figure, barefoot, orange robe with an afro, appears on the street in front of her and says, "Follow me." Just like Christ to Matthew, he beckons to her and says, "Follow me," and then he disappears. That was how she found out about Satya Sai Baba. She didn't even know who it was yet. I know someone who Baba first appeared in his bathroom in New York on Fifth Avenue. I just met someone this last trip in India. Oh yeah, well actually the way I first found out about Swami was that he appeared in my puja room and stayed for 3 hours that first time. Or I know about a dozen people who found out about Swami that way. So the physical form, what form? And Swami always says, you think I'm this form? I'm any form. You call me. I have another friend. Swami appeared to her in Shirdi form first. A blue luminous Shirdi on her bed. She was meditating on her bed, and then she opened her eyes, and Shirdi was actually there, in miniature, this radiant blue light. But it was real. I mean, so all these things, there's mysteries in heaven and earth that are sort of undreamt of in our philosophy.
don't have as many serious-minded, pious, or really advanced in their understanding Catholics as perhaps you do naturally there, because your coworkers, down the halls in Notre Dame might very well fit that bill. It's my experience that whether they're Catholics really, or Hindus, or Jews, or Muslims, they don't seem, and this is where I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, to have the number or even any experiences of the kinds you've been describing as followers of Baba seem to have. I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just trying to come up with an explanation for it. Because when people see Baba walking down the streets of Chicago, there's got to be some reason why that's happening to these people, but they don't see Christ or Muhammad or whoever it might be walking down the same street.
Well, we don't know.
We don't hear about it as much.
We don't know. I mean, there are untold numbers of Christians with intense prayer lives who have extraordinary experiences, and so I'm aware of these things. It is true that this is a particular moment. Satya Sai Baba is this extraordinary, whatever he is. I mean, again, it's and however you want to understand it. You know, in Catholic terms, because you could say, oh, well, of course he is Christ come again. That's an easy answer, and that would be fine for some people. I mean, Christ said he would come again. This is someone who's certainly, you'd have to judge. You know, each person has to make that distinction. In Catholic terms, because of the way the theology has developed, and for good reasons too, because there's extraordinary depth in Catholic thought that you start to realize why things are the way they are. You know, you couldn't just say, and this is where Don Mario Mazzoleni, for instance, his formulations, you know, you could see how they would lead into trouble, because he's not going to be dealing with people who are necessarily always moving from the deepest, you know, spiritual experience of their own, and they're trying to follow a received tradition, and they want to protect it. And Don Mario Mazzoleni will, you know, say, or this is Christ, or this is the, you know, God who sent Christ. Well, in Christian terms, that's problematic, because Christ, that name, that form, that reality is the name for the nexus, the contact between the human and the divine, for revelation. So everything, to even speak in Catholic or true Christian terms, it has to be related to that, because that's the name for that. So you would have to say then that Satya Sai Baba is a greater or lesser. In Satya Sai Baba, you see Christ more or less revealed. You know, you can put it in those terms. Those would be perfectly orthodox terms. The way you would say it, Dante pushes it farther, because he literally makes Beatrice essentially Christ. Although, again, she's a figure of Christ. She signifies Christ.
I love this conversation with you for, if no other reason, the expansive take you're giving us as listeners on the many ways in which our own spiritual paths can be interpreted, not by outsiders, but by ourselves. And I'd like to ask you a question about what I love about Christ and Baba, and that is their use of, whether they call them this or not, kind of immaterial. Parables, metaphors.
Right.
When Baba stands there, or now sits there, and speaks into a microphone that's heard on the ashram grounds by 80 to 120,000 people on any given holy day or holiday, my feeling is his message has to be interpreted at maybe 12 levels, depending on where people come from.
It works on all levels. Yeah, it works on all levels.
And Christ spoke very much intentionally the same way.
Exactly. And one of the extraordinary things, of course, is that with Swami we have actual tape transcriptions. You know, with Bible we have, you know, good traditions of conveying, you know, Christ's words and so forth. So we have a strong, but it's highly selected, you know, and even in the Gospels they'll tell us, and I could tell you 1,000 more of these wonders that Christ did, but I'll tell you these, you know. It's all highly selected. We've got, with Swami, we have like an infinite amount of information. I have a friend, a German, who has been studying carefully Satya Sai Baba's discourses from the beginning, even going back and collating with, you know, original Telugu. He's learned Telugu. He's told me, he's a great German scholar who teaches here at a university in the U.S. He was telling me, you know, in the future there are going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of scholars whose work is just this incredible. He says it's absolutely breathtaking.
That takes my breath away.
That you have no clue. He said, you know, when you hear these discourses, because a lot of them, you know, on the surface, again, as you say, there's some that sound sort of homely, you know, and again, Christ too, you know, he'll talk about fishes, he'll talk about this. It's like, well, where's the great, you know, where's the Upanishads here? You know? But it works at extraordinary levels, and in fact, he was telling me that he's been tracing in the way the discourses work over years, these patterns of cycles where they actually develop in these cycles and become more and more and more profound, and then start a new cycle, basically. But he said it rises to, because he's also written a huge book on the Upanishads and the Vedas and so forth. He said it's absolutely unparalleled. There's nothing like it, actually, when you start.
Do I gather he's a devotee?
Oh yeah, he's there every year. Yeah.
What would you say to your fellow scholars and academics who might have a conversation over a cup of coffee that goes on for 3 or 4 hours, when they just ask you earnestly and honestly, your greatest teacher, and if you were to answer that includes Sai Baba, and they wanted to know more information, where would you start? Where in the cosmos would you start to explain in order that might feed them in a way they uniquely are looking for?
You know, one thing as Swami says, who are you to advertise me? What do you know about me? My first attitude would be, my theologian friends at Notre Dame have access to an unparalleled spiritual treasure house, which can lead them straight to God, right? And now, if again, it's not we who choose our gurus. If Swami, wants them or one of them to enter into his orbit in some way for some reason, that will happen, whether I'm there or not. Swami can do it without me. I will always just be open, and people know that I have these sort of odd obsessions. But yeah, you have to trust that God can take care of God's business pretty well. We have to know what our part is. We have to be ourselves and do our part. But advertising in any way is not something that I...
Christian, you're the first person to whom I'm going to ask the same question twice. A young man who's in his early 20s stands up in class and out of the blue says, I read somewhere where you follow this Indian teacher, Sai Baba. Who is he?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if anybody asks me about Sai Baba, I answer as fully as I can. And, I invite my students to dinner usually. Classes to dinner. And it's interesting to see even there, my apartment in South Bend is essentially a huge chapel. It's like there's pictures of saints everywhere and about 100 pictures of Satya Sai Baba. There are other saints. There are all kinds of saints. There's Christ. There's
the fellow with the afro.
And it's not eclectic because truth is one, right? There's nothing eclectic about it. It's as focused as it can be. But yeah, so occasionally, and it's interesting that out of 20 students, maybe 2 will even ask, and that's how it goes. But that's fine because they have their roles. They have to go and raise families. Not everybody is,
They're not the right plum yet or pear.
And again, their own path. They follow their own path. If they're drawn to this, then that might be a path of theirs for some reason, or might enter into their path in some way. If they do ask, I'm as truthful as I can be. There's different ways to put it. Sometimes I'll say everything that you've read of Christ applies to him too, which is a rather radical thing to say. But I mean, that is my direct experience. But then I'll say, but you don't have to believe me. Don't trust me. But if it's something that's been my experience, if that's something you can investigate.
Well, the second question, asking that same question, is what if it's the same age person, or it could be somebody in their 50s, tears in their eyes and a profound spiritual search, and they're filled with pain. They're in that fire you described about an hour ago, and they've heard that you know of a teacher they're not familiar with, and they're yearning to advance themselves beyond this torturous fire when it's not blissful. How would you answer their inquiry?
Oh, always as fully as I can. I always am present with these. But again, even with students, for instance, I get a number of students, obviously, at Notre Dame who are intensely thirsty, like thirsty deer, I think, from the Psalms. They've been handed all the forms of religion and an excellent ground, but they're seeking always a deeper life in it. And they go to church and so, but they want something, and so they ask me, they come to me, and that happens quite a bit. What I often do is give them a reading list. I'll mention 10 books, and usually Satya Sai Baba will be one of them, as one possibility. But there'll be Christian mystics in there. I'll put in, Peace Pilgrim, who I think is an excellent guide, and a true American saint. who again re-reveals, as she's always said, nothing new in my message, except the practice of it. She was pretty radical about it.
That one step towards God.
Yeah, and it's all, like,
Literally.
to answer, falsehood with truth, and, hatred with love, and so that was her message. That's all, nothing just new. But she lived in the direct experience of it. And she had the very important message, which was that this spiritual growth is the natural, true birthright of every human being. That we just stop growing. First, we stop growing psychologically, usually sometime in our teenage years, with all kinds of pain that we refuse to face, and then that just stops our growth, and we're stuck there. So emotionally, most adult humans are adolescents, and they act that way. Most of our politicians, just watch, just read the news, and this is the way you would expect a 14-year-old to act. So, and as Peace often said, you can't begin the true spiritual growing up until you finish the psychological growing up. So you have to do that. You can't surrender an ego full of holes, for instance. You have to develop a healthy ego, one that's not full of complexes. That's part of growing up. Then the spiritual life can really start. And most of us don't even start it. And she has that wonderful...
In a whole lifetime that spans 8 decades, most of us don't even start.
Yeah, and and she gives that. She actually lays out a diagram of what was her path, and is she's a sort of a standard path in spiritual growing up. Spiritual life starts, she says, when first there arises in you the overwhelming impulse to give your life for something higher. To give yourself, right? Now that can be a born-again experience. It can be your baptism into the Catholic Church, your confirmation, whatever it is, but the sense, I am going to give my life to something higher. So I don't belong to me, but to God, to something greater.
Young clerics, priests, and nuns and brothers must feel that way.
Absolutely, yeah, and many of them live it then and do have extraordinary, spiritual growth in lives. I can tell you a story about that too. But that's just the start, because what happens then, she says, is that you have this battle between, let's say, it's a point of no return, but you have the battle then between your higher self and your returning ego, lower self, your old instincts and this new impulse to give yourself, and then the other one that's still like defensive and wants. That battle goes on a while, and it really helps in that whole battle if in the process you're also transforming all your habits. That should be happening so that they all become aligned in harmony with the laws of the universe, which are love, selflessness, truth, peace, right action. They're no secret. These to bring your life into harmony with the highest truths that you believe. And as you do that, she says, more and more light is given, right? And that's a constant process. And then she says, comes the first peak experience. That is the moment that then really changes things. The first peak experience is that all of a sudden you're raised beyond yourself into truth, into reality. And there's all kinds of expressions and descriptions of that in the Christian tradition. But it's your first experience of non-dual, total consciousness, where it's no longer bound in any way by the finite. And it's a sense of the absolute infinity and bedrock of reality. Now, once you have that experience the first time, you cannot live without constantly struggling to return to it. It starts usually a period of enormous turmoil, because to live out of that reality becomes literally unbearable, intolerable. But you do slip out of it a lot at the beginning and return it into a lower state of consciousness, which is again all full of, in fact, even more ego, and because the ego is sort of fighting for its life. But the way she describes is that gradually, as you constantly keep, moving back into that, you stabilize. You become more and more fixed. That is the reality. That is the actual truth of your being. And then she says there comes another point of no return, which all of a sudden, it happened for her one morning. She had, as she said, she had slipped out of harmony the day before. And before she went to bed, she walked all night in the woods. She would do that. That was her way of prayer. And she said to God, I think this form would be more useful to you if it remained in harmony. That was her way of putting it. But anyway, she woke up, and the way she put it was just that she woke up with the glorious realization that the battle was over. That she said that I would never again descend from the mountaintop. And she said at that point too, spiritual life, of course, keeps going because the divine is infinite. Obviously, it's all way beyond any of our languages and concepts. But she said it's as if a jigsaw puzzle had become complete. And then at that point, the borders of it just kept expanding. And she said it's just a steady diagonal line on, going upwards as everything just gets deeper and vaster and more infinite. But the battle, she said at that point, she realized she had succeeded in giving her life. See, that is when you fully have given your life, when the limited consciousness that does not give, right, has dissolved.
I suspect you may quote her so well because you lived her so well.
Well, she was important for me. I mean, she was important in shedding light on again, light comes from all sources. But
Jody wanted to know if you could clarify who you were talking about. Peace Pilgrim here.
This is all Peace Pilgrim.
Yeah.
This is all Peace Pilgrim. She was Peace Pilgrim is her real name was her real name. A girl was born in I think New Jersey, near East Orange, New Jersey, someplace. I think on a chicken farm. Her name was Mildred Norman, and she lived an ordinary life for 20 years, getting stuff, having a nice job, a nice car. Except that there was something different about her. It was that she realized that none of this could be really the goal of life. And she started to question very deeply. And she was raised without a direct spiritual tradition, which is extraordinary. That's very American, an American saint.
It was freeing for her.
Well, very freeing, but as Swami says, it's a very good thing to be born into a religion because it gives you. Well, he says not so good to die in one if it means that you have not reached the goal at which all paths end.
Okay.
Right. That's the Swami's more exact. Yes, if you still think, I'm a Christian and not a Muslim, well, that means, okay, then have you seen God? Right? Have you seen God? Peace Pilgrim started this deep inner inquiry with a lot of prayer and walks in nature. That was the way she would do it all night often, and kneeling and moonlit clearings. I mean, it was very, very intense, though. Intensity is kind of a key ingredient, and if you're eager for divine experience. But let me finish a minute on Peace Pilgrim. And then she lived that way for a while, but then she gradually started to, she had this initial experience of deciding to give her life to God, to something higher. And then she very systematically started to rearrange her life to live up to everything that she believed. And that was what was so radical about it. And the whole process from that first self-giving that was to the end was about 15 years, she said, in her case.
Christian, this has been a wide-ranging, fascinating, endlessly interesting discussion, and I don't say that very often. There are many questions I thought I was going to ask, and I haven't even hinted at, because we're up to an hour and 20 minutes almost. So what I wanted to do is just close for this part one, if it's okay, and maybe you'll invite Jody and me back to Chicago one day to be in your loft to hear part two. With any closing comments you'd like to make, my daughter was once asked to give a talk in a Unitarian church about where she is now. So I'll just turn the tables. Where are you now?
Where? Well, we're all in God, from God, to God. There's nothing but. No,
And you have 3 minutes before the battery runs dry.
No, there's only one ultimate goal of life, and that is to live in the direct experience of God. And we all live in God already because there's nothing but God. But to be completely aware of that is for me the only possible goal, and everything comes second to that, which has also been a problem for me because I tend to be a bit single-minded about these things. But if it's a path that it makes every other path seem very insipid. If you take one step on this path, the most extraordinary things begin to happen. And joys come that cannot be uttered.
Christian Moevs, thank you so much. Promise me there'll be a part 2.
I'm happy to. We talk all day about God. There's nothing else to talk about.
God bless you and Sai Ram.
Yeah.